Hello and welcome to another episode of Hair Bear Short Stories. And if you found your way to my cozy little corner of the internet and you like a story or two, sit back and relax, have a listen, have a laugh, take your shoes off, and set a spell. So today's chapter is a little bit longer than the previous one, so we're gonna get right into it with chapter 7 of Whole. Life goes on. 6 hours of fitful sleep later, Ben was forced to admit to himself that despite the pain in his body and the worse ache in his heart, he was going to have to get to work for his evening shift. He had managed to keep down a light meal, though it had been a near thing. It had been brought to him by Nana, who fussed and clucked over him while he picked at his food, before she herself had to depart on her own business. With a fierce hug and an ironic admonition on the dangers of excessive drinking, since apparently stay away from people who will beat you up seemed too obvious a bit of advice, she rolled off in her beast of a Chrysler. After several more unsuccessful attempts to contact Gato on the phone, he couldn't put it off any longer. He dragged his bike from the hut's little attached lean-to and headed to work. It was amazing. The kitchen back door still creaked the same way. The cooking smells, the buzz of orders and chatter of the kitchen, the clatter and sizzle of cooking, all underpinned by the muted hum of the diner's conversation. All the same, as though the world hadn't been turned inside out in a night. Ben paused at the kitchen entry and looked from face to face that did not spare him a glance, so absorbed were they in their work. No, he was wrong. Something had changed. No longer did he look on the staff with the timid hope of one day being future friends or colleagues or even competitors. He could only see people who were clawing at those above, stomping on those below, or just trying to stay out of the path of the other two. He was looking at the same picture, but he couldn't shift his focus from the shadows. Ben got his apron from its peg in the locker room, clocked in and went to his station at the sinks, and got to work. By all rights, the mountains of pots and pans should have been at least somewhat mitigated by the dishwasher on the previous shift. The same person was also meant to wait for Ben to relieve them before clocking out, but the station was abandoned, even though he was a few minutes early. People learned quickly, however, how much they can get away with when there was someone who would not only pick up the slack uncomplaining, but thank them for the privilege. Long has hard work been known to be a balm for the wounded heart, and slowly Ben's sadness was at least partially subdued as he scoured his way through the backlog. He was in a strange mood, actually. The laser focus he was exerting on searching for and ferociously eliminating every speck of grime was leaving him feeling curiously prickly and numb, like a foot you sat on for too long but wasn't so numb as to throb and complain, but would really start hurting once you got up again. Apparently, the odd feeling wasn't just him, but was going around the kitchen. It wasn't that uncommon a phenomenon. That many people working at a demanding pace, confined to the limited space of the kitchen, can make for a tense atmosphere where the dominant mood is as contagious as chickenpox. Today, others he encountered seemed a little more thoughtful and cautious than usual. As the evening wore on, when someone would come up behind him to deposit a hot/sharp item in the dirty pile, the more common "hey" or "move" that Ben often received was gradually replaced by the industry standard "behind you," and even one "excuse me" from a particularly timid-looking busboy. When Luis took time from his busy schedule to berate him for how far behind he was, Ben's flat reply of "yes, Chef Luis" didn't elicit the routine tirade that Ben always received regardless of his response. Luis only paused a moment, then went back to shouting at everyone else. Somebody important must be around that everybody's trying to impress, and this is the spillover, Ben thought distractedly. At another time, such a possibility might have at least made him curious who it might be, but tonight he couldn't muster the will to care. It was a busy night, though, and the strain of the required pace came to a head at one point, as it usually did, with Luis throwing a temper tantrum at somebody. Ben didn't know who, and in his effort to keep up with his own work, he didn't bother turning to see, but from the direction of the yelling and clanging, it was probably something to do with a line cook that wasn't prepping fast enough to keep Luis supplied. His worst snits happened when someone threw off his groove. A tingle in the back of Ben's neck made him move suddenly and unthinkingly. Acting on orders delivered directly from his hind brain, his knees buckled and he ducked to the level of the sink. A hot steel skillet ruffled his hair as it sailed over his head, clanged against the wall, and fell into his sink where it hissed and billowed steam. It hadn't been thrown at him deliberately, that much seemed obvious to Ben. He hadn't been part of the argument. The pan's trip across the room likely had more to do with an angry, abrupt gesture and a greasy hand. It was one of Luis's, which made that explanation more than likely. A large, thick-bottomed unit, which, had his head not hastily vacated the path of its trajectory, would have left him insensible for an indefinite period. Again, though, the numbness that was mercilessly hobbling his psyche just didn't allow him to give a damn. Whichever way it had arrived, it was dirty and in his station, so he put on his thicker gloves and began to scrub it out. If he got it done before it cooled too much, it would dry that much faster. After a minute or so, he gradually became aware that all movement and noise in the kitchen had ceased. He looked over his shoulder and found every single person in the room frozen in the act of whatever they were doing and staring toward him. One cook even heedless of something behind him starting to burn. Ben glanced at the wall in front of him to see if there was something interesting that he had missed. He noticed the small ding where the pan had connected. That could hardly be visible from across the room, much less be the subject of such rapt attention to everyone in it. Ben turned to face the room at large, vaguely baffled as to what was holding their interest. It wasn't like things didn't get thrown at him all the time. While some were looking directly at him, others faced a bit lower and to his left. He glanced down and was slightly bemused to find he was holding the skillet, still dripping suds. He looked down at it, and up to Luis, who was still in a retributive posture over a cowering runner, though both also had their heads turned his way. At a loss, Ben held the pan out, and for want of anything better, said, "Do you need it back right away? It's only a little dented." A small glob of soap gathered at the bottom of the pan and dripped to the tile floor. Luis's blank gaze followed it, then slid back up to Ben before he slightly shook his head. "Okay," Ben said slowly. "I'll just get back to work then." He went back to his sinks as the volume picked up and movement resumed. Weird. Whoever that VIP was, it sure had everyone on edge. Even more strange, Ben thought as he clocked out that night, was that even when Luis got that pan back, he resolutely avoided saying anything about it, or even looking at the dent. Ben hung up the ancient rotary phone that stood in the stool in the corner of his hut, the heavy plastic receiver causing the bell to ding softly. He had already been all over the vineyard that morning looking for Gato, and all the workers he had run into had been strangely reticent to divulge his whereabouts. That he wasn't out with them working bordered on the absurd, and Ben was a bit concerned, even though while they would not say where he was, all the vineyard hands assured him that he was fine. The ring of the phone, seconds after he had hung it up, took him completely off guard, and he nearly upset his makeshift dining table. One of the two bells in the phone's ringer had long since broken, generating a tone of alternating rings and clacks when struck by the small, wildly gyrating hammer. The resultant din caused by an incoming call was enough to set his Zen master's teeth on edge. That he only jumped back and bumped the table when taken by surprise and in such close proximity to such a sudden racket, instead of breaking his spine from a violent full-body spasm was, if anything, an indication of some residual mental numbness. Ben snatched up the phone. "Gato?" "Pero," replied a distinctly not Gato-ish voice on the other end. "What? Who? ¿Qué? ¿Quién?" came the voice again, cutting him off. "Gee, it's been a while since I've had a Spanish pop quiz, and it's awfully fun, Ben, but it's really not the reason I called." Ben's brain was having trouble keeping up. "Wait, Steve?" "There he is," crowed the jovial voice through the receiver. "How are you, little brother? Have you been overdoing it on the local produce? You seem a little slower on the uptake than usual." Currently occupied as he was with finding his friend, this voice from his other life seemed almost surreal. But Ben grinned, and the ragged edges of his nerves calmed somewhat as his mind fell into a familiar pattern. "Something like that. But it's been so long it took me a while to place the voice. To what do I owe the honor? Am I being sued?" Ben's brother, Steve, was an up-and-coming junior lawyer. He had been headhunted by a firm in Boston right out of law school, where he had been busy making a name for himself. "Only people with any assets to procure get sued," Steve quipped. "And even though you're probably the last person in the world that still uses a landline, it should make calls out, too." The back-and-forth ribbing had been how Steve had finally gotten Ben to engage with him, drawing forth a wit and intellect hitherto unrealized by either. It became their way of communicating and relating to one another that they could pick up seamlessly after months apart. Ben riposted, That's true, but my relationship with your secretary was becoming uncomfortably familiar. How is Martha, by the way? I think her husband was scheduled for a heart procedure last week. Triple bypass, his brother replied. Be back on his feet in no time. I'll be sure to send her your love. You are surely a kind and sympathetic employer. I have a coffee mug that says so. So who's Gato? Ben grimaced and downshifted from verbal joust mode. A friend I've been trying to get a hold of. I haven't seen him since last night when we got into a fight with some guys in the vineyard. We were both pretty roughed up. He pretty much saved my ass, and I wanted to make sure he was all right. A fight? Repeated Steve incredulously. You? The pacifist? Wow. Most people go out to the West Coast to mellow out. When did you get so feisty? They didn't really leave us any choice, Ben demurred. There's always a choice, Benny. But if it's out-and-out assault we're talking about, I can definitely help there. Not with these guys, Ben muttered darkly. The tone of voice did not escape Steve. Ah, it's like that. Well, some people aren't as untouchable as they might seem either. You'd be surprised. Ben shook his head to dispel dark thoughts. How could you help me from Boston anyway? Ah, well, that's why I called in the first place before you so rudely derailed my train of thought. I'm going to be in your neighborhood tomorrow. Finally taking some time off? I've been getting tired of you dodging me with the whole I gotta work excuse. Nope, business trip. You suck. Hey now. We have a client with a house out there in a local legal dispute, and we need a representative of the firm to be present for some proceedings that will take a couple hours at the most. I've banked enough goodwill with my boss that I was able to wrangle a return date 2 days afterward, so we'll have plenty of time to hang. Tomorrow, though? Ben said, somewhat mollified but not willing to concede. You couldn't have given me more notice? I've got a job too. I only found out half an hour ago, Steve returned. I talk a big game, but I'm still the low man around here. I was pretty surprised I was able to get this much time there, but I haven't had a day off for 3 straight months. All right, I'll check the schedule and see what time I have off, Ben replied. It doesn't really matter anyway. You think you're the low man. I couldn't request time off if I gave them 2 years' notice and promised them my firstborn. That's because they know you'll never get laid, Steve laughed. My flight gets in just after noon tomorrow, and I should be done with my work stuff by the evening. Do you have your cell phone set up yet? Ben dug his prepaid phone out of his pocket. It was powered down. Yeah, I haven't used it much. It's crazy what they charge for minutes. That's why I sent you the gift certificate for it. I'll never be able to get a hold of you if I have to try to get you on this landline all the time. This is the 3rd time I've called you just to tell you I'm coming. Seriously? Ben asked. Nah, I got you in 1, but how many times will it be that lucky? Give me the cell number. Ben gave Steve his number, and his brother said goodbye with a promise to call the following evening. He hung up the phone and shook his head. Stephen Royce friggin' Esquire. Ben came from a family of success stories, of winners. His parents held multiple degrees and PhDs and trained for Spartan races in their off time. Add that to his brother's academic career and athletic achievements through high school and college, and it all put Ben squarely in black sheep territory. His parents tried, they really did, but they could not relate to their apparently stunted younger son. His dad would assure him that if he just tried a bit harder, he would get there eventually. His mom would affectionately refer to him as her late bloomer, and Steve would say, who cares, let's go play video games. Easy for him to say. He kicked Ben's ass in them too, and still had a room full of trophies. He further confused them when he refused all financial aid and fled to the other side of the country to seek what education and experience he could get on his own, slugging it out in the trenches until he could beat his life into submission. Speaking of trenches, in order to determine for himself once and for all that Gato was not lying in a ditch somewhere, Ben would have to go look for him in the last place he would expect to find him in the daytime. Gato's house. Ben knocked on the door for the 3rd time and rang the doorbell for the 5th. He thought he had heard movement a couple of times and was certain he saw the curtains twitch at one point. What the hell was going on? Nobody ought to be home this time of day, but someone was clearly in the house and was giving him the Jehovah's Witness treatment. Nobody in Gato's family would ignore even a stranger at their door. Their old-school sense of good manners would not allow it. At the very least, they would answer the door and give a reasonable excuse why an annoying visitor should piss off. and Ben was under the impression that most of them rather liked him. That left the possibility that someone else was in their house, perhaps unbeknownst to them. A shiver went down his spine as a thought belatedly occurred to him. Those guys from the other night were not just in the vineyard joyriding. They were purposely out for blood and knew that workers sometimes lodged nearby. He and Gato had gotten away. What if they had tracked him down and were back for round 2? He had backed 3 steps away from the door, readying to bolt, when he had another thought. If they were here, they were waiting for Gato and his family, who, if Ben ran away, would come home eventually and be unaware of the possible danger. He could go look for them and warn them, but it was more likely somebody would come home before he could track them all down. Calling the police about the suspicion of a possible intruder in a place that houses an ever-fluctuating number of immigrant field workers might get somebody out there in an hour or 2 if he was lucky. No, he was going to have to sack up and check this out himself. Maybe the police would be more likely to respond if he could verify the intrusion himself. If someone was there, they must be aware of his presence, but there was nothing for that now. Ben retrieved the spare key from a nearby flower pot and cast about for the nearest thing he could use as an offensive implement. Making the best available choice, he hefted it as he slipped the key into the lock and eased the door open as quietly as he could. Ben padded softly into the small entryway. The inside of the house stood quiet and dark. All the curtains would have to be closed to be so dim in mid-afternoon. As he stood and waited for his eyes to adjust, he listened intently and tried to calm the fluttering in his stomach. There was a definite rustling sound from the living area adjacent to his hiding place. With his heart hammering in his chest, Ben took a deep breath and leapt into the room wielding his weapon high above his head. Gato? The adrenaline that had carried Ben this far abruptly drained from him, and a drop of water slowly fell onto his head from the tin watering can in his hand. He dropped it to the floor with a clank. Someone was sitting up straight in a chair in the far corner of the room. Even in the low light, Ben could clearly see it was Gato. He made no move, nor did he respond when Ben said his name. "Gato, are you all right?" Ben asked. "Didn't you hear me at the door?" Still nothing. His face was too deep in shadow to see his eyes, but he was sitting far too rigidly to be asleep or anything else. Ben went to the nearest window and abruptly threw open the drapes. He sighed a bit in relief when the sudden flood of sunlight made Gato flinch slightly. He still held a 1,000-yard stare toward the other side of the room, but the reaction showed he was at least somewhat up on current events. Other than that, it didn't look like his friend had moved from that spot, possibly since Ben had last seen him. He was unwashed and unkempt, and it looked like he still had some dried blood around his nose from nearly 2 days ago. "Seriously, man, are you all right?" Ben said, stepping closer. "'Cause you're kind of starting to freak me out." Gato's eyes slowly swiveled to orient on Ben without moving his head. His fingertips were dug into the arms of the chair he was sitting in, his body practically vibrating with tension. Ben gradually became aware that he was muttering something over and over, barely moving his lips. He took a few steps closer before he could make it out. "Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío, Dios mío." Ben backed away from his clearly disturbed friend. When he got as far as the kitchen door, the muttering stopped, and some of the strain seemed to ease from his posture. To say this was out of character was like saying Nana had to shoot alcohol and taken up marathon running. Ben had never seen Gato in any other way than confident and in control. He hadn't even thought his friend capable of being this unnerved. Just what in the fresh hell had happened after Ben had blacked out that night? "How about I make some coffee?" Ben said slowly. "You look like you could use a cup." He turned into the kitchen, trying not to move too suddenly. Maybe if he could calm Gato down a bit, he could get something out of him. Some caffeine should make him less jittery. Sure. Yeah. "It was a devil," came Gato's strained voice from behind him. Ben paused in the doorway. A devil? Metaphorical, maybe, and way more dramatic than he thought the pragmatic Mexican would ever be, but he could see where Gato was coming from. What else would possibly drive someone to do such things? "Yeah," Ben said. "I guess I could see it too." He looked over at Gato, who had actually turned his head this time to orient fully on Ben. His face, though still mostly blank, managed to convey a touch of confusion. "In their faces," Ben responded to the unasked question. "When I saw any of them up close, mostly the one who hurt Scruff. Especially when he was doing it. He had such a gleam in his eyes, like a kid on Christmas. I really think that wasn't even the worst thing they wanted to do, just the best opportunity to hurt someone they could find at the moment. How else could somebody be like that without a demon on their shoulder?" Gato stared at him for a long moment. "No," he said slowly. "He was just some asshole." Ben blinked. "Then what?" "It was a devil that killed them," Gato said, and turned his face away to the window. Ben felt the blood drain from his face. Killed them? What had Gato done? Even for all that he seemed to have a shady past, Ben wouldn't think him capable of killing somebody. To protect Ben, though, he might. Ben could also see why it would have freaked him out. Even with a legal status and a clear-cut case of self-defense, it could easily get him deported. And that was if he was lucky. How would his family manage without him? The crew? Was even all this enough to make a hardened character like Gato snap and blame it on a devil? Ben crossed the room and knelt in front of the chair. "Gato, what did..." Gato turned a sudden, intense glare on him that brought him up short. The weathered vineyard worker's dark eyes, peering at him from under knotted brows, pinned him in place like a dead butterfly. "A devil killed them," he repeated softly. "With your hands." Oh, that got a little bit intense, didn't it? So Gato is saying that it was Ben after he blacked out. But how could Ben do that? How's that possible? Why do you think everyone at work is treating Ben differently? And we've got Ben's brother coming into the mix now. How's that going to change the dynamic? Are we going to find out more about his past and his other life? What do you think? If you have any thoughts about how things might go or what's already happened, leave it in the comments and let us know. And as always, if you like this chapter, slap upon the like and subscribe button. And hopefully, we'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care, be good, and bear up.